Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Fish Farmers' first Aqua Agenda webinar. I'll introduce the topic first. In 2022, Scotland's salmon farming industry saw a high level of mortalities that took a heavy toll on harvest numbers, on profits, and on the reputation of the sector. We'll be looking today at the lessons that have been learned, what the outcomes look like in 2023, and what the prospects are for better fish health and survival rates in future. We've got a great panel for you here this morning. Dr. Iain Berrill, Head of Technical with Salmon Scotland, Charles Allan, Head of the Scottish Fish Health Inspectorate, and Ronnie Soutar, Head of Veterinary Services at Scottish Sea Farms. The format's pretty simple. Each of our panelists will say a few words, and then we'll take questions, including some questions which have been previously supplied. Just to clarify, you can see us, but we can't see or hear you as attendees. If you have questions, you'll need to submit them via the Q&A tab, which you'll find at the bottom and center of your screen. So to begin with, if I can introduce Dr. Iain Berrill. Iain Berrill has always had an interest in the marine and freshwater environment. He took a BSc in marine biology at Swansea University and went on to complete an MSc in applied fish biology at Plymouth University, followed by a PhD at the Institute of Aquaculture in Stirling, where he studied the freshwater development of farmed Atlantic salmon. He undertook postdoctoral research at the University of Bangor in North Wales, focusing on Arctic char, before returning to Scotland and the Institute of Aquaculture to undertake research on farmed fish welfare. In 2010, Iain moved into the Scottish salmon farming sector to work for SSPO, now Salmon Scotland, the industry trade body. Initially brought in to set up and manage an industry fish health database, he is currently head of technical, providing technical input into all aspects of the organisation's activities, with a key focus on fish health and welfare, the environment, and science and research. Iain is a former director and trustee of the Scottish Aquaculture Research Forum, a steering group member of the multinational Gill Health Initiative, and a member of the Stakeholder Advisory Board of AWRM. He sits on various industry and governmental working groups and acts in a steering group and advisory capacity on several collaborative research projects. Iain, over to you.
Thank you, Robert. As Robert has said, I've head of technical at Salmon Scotland. I oversee what is now called the membership services team, but that is in actual fact what most people would see as the traditional technical team. And as well as the points that Robert has picked up on there, my coverage includes science and innovation and regulation and policy, which are relevant in this arena. What do we do in this space around fish health from a Salmon Scotland perspective? Well, our role is very much as facilitators. We operate a number of health managers meetings where the company health managers can come together and discuss and share experiences, and we do that very regularly. We also provide networking on top of that. And of course, health managers are engaging on a regular basis themselves. But we also try to help through a range of technical events and supporting research, which is of value. And we have another mechanisms through our membership to do that. As well as our health managers group, we also have a prescribing vets group, which is independent of us, but we provide secretariat services for that. And that's a really important group within the context of fish health, because it allows key vets from all of the prescribing practices to come together and discuss veterinary issues and share experiences as well. The other thing that we've done within the trade body is help the industry with its transparency agenda. And we have been proactively publishing lice data in particular in some form since 2010. And that the resolution of that is increased until 2018, where we started publishing that data on a farm by farm level. And at that time, we added in mortality data. And that was quite important for this discussion today. We published what we believe to be the two most valuable or useful pieces of information for interested parties on mortality, and that is the mortality rate on a monthly basis, and then the overall population mortality for those fish on the farm when they are fully harvested. But this is a difficult space, and I just wanted to highlight that there are a number of different metrics of mortality that have been published. All of them are accurate, but there are differences in the numbers, and that has caused some confusion in this space, which which is not sometimes helpful. The last 2 years, which I think we're probably here to talk about today, we've clearly seen some challenges, and our sector have been open about those, and we've narrated about those quite clearly in the press. We've got numerous things to discuss today, and I'm looking forward to that. There will almost certainly be a discussion around climate change. And from my perspective, I firmly believe climate change is a challenge for all of society. Whether the challenges we've experienced over the last couple of years fall into that category, we don't clearly have the evidence for that, but let's not be naive. What we can say is that there have been significant changes in our marine environment, which are causing some challenges for farming from a health perspective. Finally, I just wanted to pick up on one important last message, really, to try and help frame the discussion today. We've been quite upset because we've been compared, or our mortality rates have been compared to other sectors. And in that context, I'd make two observations. I would say that we have proactively published our data, and we are in actual fact the only sector to publish mortality data on a farm-by-farm basis in the UK. Every other livestock sectors, as I understand, don't do that. But also globally, I believe we're the only the only salmon farming sector to do that. So it's really difficult to make sort of sweeping generalizations about how we compare to other sectors without solid data. But more importantly than that, I would say we have to remember that fish are completely different, or salmon are a completely different species, and fish are a different class of animal to birds and mammals, which are traditionally farmed. We have an animal which essentially produces thousands of eggs with the hope of a couple of those going on to survive, to reproduce in its natural life. Birds and mammals have completely different strategies. Our fish also have very different physiologies. So we have to remember that, and I would urge everybody listening today to remember that, moving on in terms of the questions that we have. So I'll wrap up there, and I'll hand back to Rob.
Thanks, Iain. Charles Allan has been involved in the Scottish aquaculture industry in both commercial and statutory roles for more than 30 years, including working in a small commercial salmon company at Scotland's Fish Health Inspectorate and the Marine Laboratory in Aberdeen. He has led the Fish Health Inspectorate since 2008, being responsible to Scottish ministers for the delivery of all aquatic animal health legislation in Scotland. In 2022, Charles took on additional responsibilities as Senior Delivery Lead for Aquaculture and Fish Health, Freshwater Fisheries and Biosecurity. Charles is currently responsible for delivery of all of the scientific work of staff in the areas of aquaculture, fish health, salmon and freshwater fisheries, and biosecurity within the science, evidence, data and digital portfolio of the Marine Directorate of the Scottish Government. Charles, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Robert. As you said, I'm responsible to Scottish ministers for delivery of, amongst others, the aquatic animal health regulations, which are really pertinent to today's discussion. We also publish an awful lot of data. Iain referred to sea lice data and mortality data. We don't necessarily publish a full set industry-wide. There are certainly certain regulatory requirements. So our mortality figures will vary from Iain's mortality figures, and there are good reasons for that. It's not that either data set is incorrect. It's just that they are published for different purposes. I think much of what we will discuss today, I will discuss from a regulatory point of view, but bringing in 30 years of experience in the industry, and certainly I'm looking forward to an in-depth, lively, and informative discussion today. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Charles. And finally, Ronnie Soutar. Ronnie Soutar has been involved as a vet in aquaculture for more than 35 years. He is currently employed as head of veterinary services for Scottish Sea Farms, one of Scotland's leading salmon farmers. He holds a master's degree in aquatic veterinary studies from Stirling University and is a past president of the Fish Veterinary Society. He represents fish vets on the Scottish Government Farm Fish Health Network Health Framework Working Group, and is a current member of the Veterinary Products Committee, advising the Veterinary Products Committee with the VMD on medicines issues in aquaculture. In May 2022, Ronnie completed a 9-year term as a trustee of Scotland's foremost animal welfare charity, the Scottish SPCA, having been chair of the board for the previous 4 years. Ronnie.
Thanks, Rod, and apologies for all those acronyms. I guess the important thing is that I work now for Scottish Sea Farms. As you said, we're the second largest salmon farming company in Scotland, and I lead a vet team of 4 vets, including myself, which I think is the largest vet team within a salmon farming company. And we sit within a wider fish health and welfare team, which reports directly to the chief exec of the company. So fish health and welfare is important to SSF, and important to the sector as a whole, as both Iain and Charles have highlighted. So it's good to be here today to talk about just what are the issues affecting the health and welfare of salmon, and perhaps maybe today get to the difference between what are the real issues and what are the perceived issues. I don't now spend a great deal of my time thinking about sea lice, but if you listen to wider social media, you would think that that was the biggest thing happening. I do spend a lot of time thinking about gill health, and I reckon that's probably 50% of what's affecting the fish that I care for. And just for perspective, on any given day, our vet team will have about 20 million salmon under our care. It compares, Iain made some comparisons to other livestock sectors. There's not many vets out there in other sectors with that number of animals that they have responsibility for. Admin, would you pop up the graph that I had? Don't want to there's only this one graph from me today, and nobody else has made a presentation, but I think for me this is absolutely crucial. This is showing the sea temperatures across the year on Scottish Sea Farms, mainland farms. The actual temperatures will be a bit different, the profile on our Orkney and our Shetland farms, but the picture is much the same. And what you're looking at there is an 8-year average of temperatures, that's the orange line, and then blue for 2021, green for 2022, and red for 2023, maybe quite appropriate for 2023. And you can see that 21 followed pretty much the 8-year average, in fact, a bit of a cooler winter. But in both of the last 2 years, the winter temperatures have been higher, and that's important for what survives in terms of sea organisms over winter. Never, on average, dipping below 8 at that early part of 2023. And then it rose quicker. So, you know, whereas normally we're topping up around 14, we got very close to 14 in the middle of the year by July, and we were above 12 in June. And in fact, there was one of our farms that hit 14 in June, and then peaked out around 15, and we had at least one farm where we saw 16 before dropping off. And that's crucially important to what we're going to talk about today. The graph can go down now, thanks. Why that should be so when those temperatures are well within the preferred range for salmon is, I think, key to what we talk about. Salmon won't suffer directly as a result of those temperatures, and that's important to remember. But there is an impact on everything else which is in the sea, the pathogens, the parasites, and just the organisms which can impact upon fish. So that for me is a very key point that I'd like to address today. As part of that, in addition to the impact that there has been on gill health, we've seen bacterial challenges over the last 2 years, some of which we haven't seen for quite a while, some of which we've never seen before. And my comments today, when I say these, are not specifically about Scottish Sea Farms. We have, as Iain mentioned, a good network across the vets who work in the salmon sector and share information well. So my comments will be generally about the sector rather than just about what's in SSF. But certainly bacteria have been an issue. Predation has certainly been a factor in what's going on. We've seen some regulatory changes affecting seals that, in my opinion, have had a direct result, a negative result on fish health and welfare. And that's a significant factor. We ourselves have husbandry methods which are changing from certainly how they were when I first started, about the same length of time ago that Charles got involved in the sector I did. And so we've seen husbandry as well as infrastructure changing over that time. I think we undoubtedly handle fish more than we used to, and we should consider both the pros, the benefits of what we do, and the cons, where there might be a negative impact of those handling. When it comes on to our response, I'm very firmly of the opinion that a response to the challenges that we face has to be through husbandry and farming strategies. It's not about treatments. You might think as a vet, I was all about treatment. That's absolutely not the way. But without a doubt, prevention is better than cure, and how we manage and handle our fish is very significant in terms of what our outcomes should be expected to be. And that comes right down to farm design. I'm very pleased to say that certainly within SSF, the veterinary and the fish health and welfare team are absolutely involved in the planning and the strategy for farming. And that's important for me, but I think it's important for the fish as well. We will touch on gill health, and I've mentioned that already, but there are some really key and important ways in which we are addressing gill health issues. But there are also some things that are not available to us, things that strategies and that other livestock sectors use in animal health that we can't access, and things that are available to the salmon sector in other countries that we in Scotland can't access. And that's important. But we do have a medical armoury that is changing, it's restricted, but the way in which we use it is important, and it's affected by regulation. We have a whole range now of other treatment options, and particularly treatment vessels. That links back to my comment about the handling of fish, and you know, we use these things as we use medicines in a way that will have both pros and cons. The whole range of other things we can perhaps touch on if there's time, including cleaner fish, their benefits and the challenges that they themselves face. But I guess I'll round up just by coming back to the points that Iain and Charles made about data. A lot of data is generated by our sector. A lot of it is made public. Most of that making public does me absolutely no good at all when it comes to trying to help fish health and welfare. It's of interest to others. What is of massive benefit is the sharing of data within the sector. I mentioned the prescribing vets group that meets, as Iain said, under his secretariat in Salmon Scotland, though independent of that body. But that sharing of data between vets and between fish health and welfare professionals and between farmers generally, the people directly at the coalface of fish production, is of massive benefit to our sector. And hopefully sessions like this where we share information do the same thing.
Thanks, Ronnie. So if we can start off for our sort of general discussion, I wanted to ask, and starting with Iain, if that's okay, how much do the primary causes of mortality change year on year? The kind of mix of biological challenges, is that pretty much the same in 2022, 23 as it was 5 or 10 years ago, or do these change quite significantly?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue strongly that they change quite significantly, certainly on a macro scale. If we look back to the mid-1990s, the challenges that the sector was facing there are much, much different to what the challenges were at the start of the 2010s. Obviously, in 2010s, we started to experiencing AGD, and that developed into gill health challenges. And as is well narrated, the harmful algal blooms and harmful jellyfish over the last couple of years have been prominent. So I would say there are changes. There's some consistencies in some of the challenges, I would say, but there are also changes over the longer term. And also we have to remember that there's always changes in the complexity of the challenge that faces the likes of Ronnie and the health teams. Very rarely, I think, are health professionals sort of faced with one challenge. They have to consider how best to manage a suite of challenges that may be coming at their fish. So I would argue they've changed quite dramatically, with some level of certainty around some of the sort of longer standing challenges.
Charles, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would reflect on the fact that interventions have also changed. Ronnie and I have been around the block a few times. When I joined the sector, the challenges were furunculosis and IPNV, along with sea lice. But what we have seen is an investment in fish health controls, the introduction of vaccination for furunculosis initially did a huge amount for survival, but nature abhors a vaccine, and other pathogens emerge as primary pathogens. I think I would probably typify the 90s as being more dominated by viral diseases rather than bacterial diseases. But again, we have seen the fish pharmaceutical industry step up. So access to a wider suite of vaccines has aided survival. And the earlier part of this century and to the current day, we have seen an emergence of a number of pathogens which previously weren't of concern. Now, whether that is driven by climate change or whether it is driven by the fact that we preserve the health in the face of other challenges, and these new challenges simply come to the fore and become more visible, it's difficult to understand. But watching the progression of pathogen emergence is interesting, and generally you will see an improvement flow through the industry in how to deal with these pathogens. But the initial understanding of what the pathogen does, how it works, how it affects fish, through to effective treatment, to me is key in improving fish health and welfare going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Ronnie, anything to add to that? Your thoughts on the sort of the changing pattern of challenges?
Yeah, I would agree with both Iain and Charles on these points, and I think particularly on the complexity or the interrelatedness of the challenges that fish can face. I'm looking at some figures that suggest that about half of fish mortalities in the last 2 years were caused by or were related to gill health, and maybe another 50% viral and 10% bacterial challenges. That's fine as it stands, but it doesn't really give the picture, which is one of the interrelationship between these things. I mentioned that I don't spend a lot of time thinking about sea lice, but I do think a lot of time spending about the effects of controlling sea lice, because we do control them very well now, but the controls have an impact themselves. And so there are, for example, situations where fish may have gill health challenges, which would make me think that I'd rather leave them alone to cope with that. They will heal gills very well given a chance. But if we have to do some form of intervention to keep sea lice at a level which may not be actually impacting upon the fish themselves, there's a potential negativity there. And I also, when I was making the introductory remarks, just to maybe give an example of the complexity, I mentioned the effect of steel predation on salmon. Now, seals can have a direct impact on fish. They can bite through the nets and catch salmon as they're swimming past. They can make holes in the nets and get in, which of course is bad all round, and they can attack fish. And there's a suggestion that pens need to be sturdier to create more of a barrier, and that's fair enough. And big moves have been made in that area. But just keeping seals out of pens is not the whole story. We've seen real issues since the ban on acoustic deterrent devices, ADDs, which means that there are more seals around pens. And I have no shadow of doubt, and I know my fellow vets agree with me, that impact of the presence of a large predator is a stress on fish, and stress affects immunity, and that can certainly be seen to be linked to an increase in viral diseases in particular when the fish are stressed. So there's complexity there that just coming down to causes and what's the top cause this year kind of misses out. But without a doubt, we see changes from year to year, and we've seen some new things in the sea over the last couple of years, things that we weren't aware were there before that can impact fish health.
Ronnie, I'd like to come back to you with the next question. You mentioned climate change and sea temperatures, and I just wanted to explore a bit. If we're talking about the problems of climate change, from what you're saying, we're not just talking about the effect of sea temperatures on salmon, so much as the effect of sea temperatures on other biological factors in the sea. I wonder if you could explore that a little bit. And also, we have a question from Adrian at Crown Estate, Scotland, who points out if climate change is a factor, this is an ongoing thing. It's not going to be just a problem for this year or next year. Is there a need for a more fundamental change in how or where salmon is farmed in Scotland, rather than just looking for different treatment options for the problems that we've got? Is there something more, in other words, strategic, rather than just tactical, that we need to think about if we are looking at what I think almost inevitably is going to be a warmer world over the next decades?
Okay, well, first of all, hello to Alex. Nice to hear that he's involved. But I think I'll put his question on response to the back burner and maybe expand a bit on why it's an issue, first of all, which was the first part of your question, and then come back round to that point of what we do about this. So yeah, as I said before, I don't believe that the temperature is in itself an issue for the salmon, but it's the impact on everything else, on the pathogens, on the parasites, and on just the sea organisms that through their nature, through toxicity or other elements of their biology, can have an impact on fish health, and particularly on gill health. So if we look back to 2018, that was within that average that was on the graph that popped up earlier. 2018, as I'm sure most people will remember, is when we had the beast from the east. It was around March sort of time of that year. Very cold winter and not all that warm a summer. And fish survival in that year was good across that summer. And I think that relationship between winter temperatures and fish health is just as important as the peak summer temperatures to fish health. Because in mild winters, organisms in the sea survive better. The direct pathogens, lice, the amoeba that cause AGD, amoebic gill disease, survive better and are there in the spring to cause problems. We know that there are organisms whose range is changing with these changed temperatures. We've seen jellyfish whose names of species I am learning on almost a monthly basis, which were previously known in the Mediterranean or the English Channel, maybe expanding through the Irish Sea in the in the summer, but then feeding back as sea temperatures drop. We've seen these species having more of an impact across more of a year and a wider range. So there's without a doubt a temperature impact. As Iain said, whether that's climate change or whether it's part of a cyclical change and we'll see it drop, there's very cold weather we've had recently has certainly been a blessing to the fish just now. So we'll have to wait for some time before we know whether that is a genuine trend and to what extent it will be a factor every year. But we have to plan for it. I think maybe I'll stop at that point, and then if you want to give the others a chance, then we can come back to what we might do in response.
Yeah. So, Iain, any thoughts on that? What does climate change mean in practical terms in terms of the problems that farmers are facing?
In terms of the response that they're going to feed back to it, I can maybe comment a little bit on that, the latter half of the question from Charles, from Alex, if that's okay. And it's a very good point, and it's a very pertinent point at the moment. And I suppose I'll make one reflection before I sort of discuss the detail of that is that recently, in recent years, the last 5 years certainly, there's been a lot of use of two words, the status quo, and that's frustrated me, and it's frustrated a lot within the sector, because the status quo is not something I've ever observed in my relatively short period of time in the industry, and I'm sure it's not what Ronnie and Charles have experienced in their perhaps longer period of time. The industry is always innovating, and that's for sure. And in this space, in terms of I think the sentiment of Alex's question is what's the long-term prognosis for how we farm our fish, not the sort of finer details of how we manage fish health. And I think there are very clear changes and very clear developments which are a natural development of where we are moving. And different companies have different strategies depending on where they are. So no one solution fits the bill. And I think that's really important here, is that there are a number of different options, and they are used and deployed in the right circumstance. So what are the options? So we've heard a lot about closed containment systems, that they are likely to have their place. In some guys, there are still some challenges and still some work to do and some science to develop until they're more widely used. We have using the existing portfolio of farms that we have in different ways, using nursery sites, nursery locations. We have developing farms further offshore or into more exposed locations. And we have strategies around increasing the size of our smolt, so that we have larger fish that are going to turn to the year, shortening the marine cycle. So this is a continual development that I see, and I don't see that changing. I see there to be continual development, to continual innovation. But coming back to the key point that we all picked up on in our introduction, and that's got to be driven by data, knowledge, and experience. I think there's sometimes a little bit of an expectation that if there is a new innovation out there, that everybody should be embracing that. That we have to be very, very careful. We have to make sure we've got solid evidence, as much evidence as we need to progress with that. And it would be foolhardy for everybody to start using one system because it's deemed the most appropriate. As I say, it's very much about the best system in the best context in the best location, with at the center of that a clear focus on the fish health and welfare. If we don't have a focus on fish health and welfare, then as we always have, then businesses are going to struggle.
Charles, anything to add on climate change? I mean, I guess as a whole,
I don't know if it's my end or your end, Robert. You're breaking up.
A big ongoing issue, and I would assume that you're kind of part of that. Sorry, just to recap, climate change is clearly a big issue for the Scottish Government, which I would guess that you're a part of in terms of the overall looking at climate change as a series of risks. Any thoughts on how that specifically affects aquaculture?
It's always difficult being third because a lot of the points that I was going to bring out have already been made. What Ronnie said with regard to the link between winter temperature and associated or mortality associated with pathogens in the following year, I would add, that one of our epidemiologists in the Marine Directorate has done some work on that, and there is an identified link. So it's more than supposition. With regard to the specifics of climate change and the challenge of a changing pathogen background, we will see new things emerge, but we may also see other pathogens which have been historically of concern actually declining in a warming environment. From a regulatory point of view, we have a requirement to consider emerging disease, and there is an almost constant horizon scanning conducted both at a Scottish and a UK and indeed international level to see what we have and potentially what we could get. One senior observer in the international arena suggests that in other farming nations, a new problem emerges about once a year. And we need to be live to what is happening elsewhere and considering that in the Scottish context. Because as others have intimated, these things that are emerging, and understanding what the cumulative impact is also something that we need to be very well aware of.
So, and you mentioned being aware of what's happening in other countries. If I could throw a question initially to Iain, we were talking about obviously the challenges in Scotland, but what's the comparison? Are the issues faced by Scotland very, very different? Is it pretty much across the whole of the North Atlantic? Salmon producers, if you're looking at Iceland, Faroes, Norway, for example, or further around the world, are salmon farmers generally facing similar things, or is it very different based on which particular set of waters you're farming in?
That's an interesting and from my perspective, quite challenging question to answer. We do see similarities almost certainly, and I think we can probably draw back to similar environments, similar latitudes. I mean, if we look at Norway, for example, and it's not for me necessarily to comment too much on Norway, but Norway's coastline is huge, covers a lot of latitudes, and even within that, they will see differences in the profile of some of the challenges that they experience. So we will see differences in different areas. Tasmania, for example, primary problem has always been AGD, and that's been a more recent challenge for us. So there are latitudinal and geographical differences, but there are similarities, and I think certainly the cluster that we have with Ireland, ourselves, Norway, we do see similarities, and then some of those similarities do sort of cross over to the likes of Canada, the Faroes, and Iceland, albeit those are at much higher latitudes. So I think there is a complex place, or a complex discussion around this, really. But I think we certainly do see similarities, definitely with us in Ireland, and definitely us with Norway. And the key is that we ensure that we're all engaging. One of the real benefits of having businesses that operate on the global arena is that knowledge sharing within the businesses and then across the sectors that operate in different countries. Health is pre-competitive. Ensuring the health of our fish is critical. So there is a sharing of intelligence and not information, data, so that people are fully aware of what's going on in those other jurisdictions. Particularly, as I say, in Ireland, the Faroes, due to our membership changing, obviously ownership changing, and Norway.
Charles, is this the sort of message that you're getting from your counterparts in other countries? Sorry.
Sorry, was it?
For Ronnie, was that?
Sorry, wasn't sure if you got me there. Is this the sort of message that you're getting from counterparts in other governments, other countries?
Charles, I think that was for you.
Okay.
Charles?
I missed the reference. I'm sorry.
So sorry. Is the is the message messages that you're getting from your counterparts in other countries that they're facing similar kinds of issues, or are there quite big differences in their priorities?
I think you'll find largely the priorities are the same. We obviously maintain contact both with foreign authorities, but also reference labs in other countries. We share information on more usually with difficult cases or new emergencies, but there are both formal and informal contacts between governments. There is a quadrilateral arrangement, which obviously involves Norwegian government as one of our nearest farming partners. But more importantly to me is that the sharing of clinical information between reference labs in other countries.
And Ronnie, obviously through Scottish Sea Farms co-owners, I guess you get you get to share information around the wider group. What kind of messages are you getting?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Robert. The international ownership of salmon companies in Scotland sometimes attracts negativity. Actually, it's a major positive for us in terms of knowing what's happening elsewhere. And for us, there's that direct route to Norway, but I have on a every couple of weeks basis a discussion with a good friend who now looks after fish health in Iceland. As Charles mentioned, the ownership of Bakkafrost gives them information from the Faroes, and all that comes into a melting pot of good data that we can draw from. I think in terms of the challenges and whether they're the same or different depends how granular you want to be. I think on a big picture, Charles is absolutely spot on. The general challenges are the same, but when you come down to location, it can be the challenges can vary just up the coast of Scotland, never mind between us and Norway. So I think looking at that and the lessons that we take from that international picture is leading us to solutions based in, as I said before, husbandry and farming strategies. And some of that just comes down to what are the right fish to farm in Scotland. What is a farmed Scottish salmon and what gives it the properties that we need? Because there is no doubt that and the advances in genetics has perhaps been the most spectacular thing that's happened in the 3 decades and more that I've been involved. So we now have the ability to develop farmed salmon that really do well in the Scottish environment as that changes, because the generation time is short, and that can have real positives for us. And I think the other area where there have been big developments which help us is in nutrition. We have diets now that are so carefully made to suit fish, and also to adapt. We have functional foods, we have nutraceuticals that can really make a difference to the health of our salmon, either in the long term or in response to specific challenges. And those are different to the foods that might be appropriate for a salmon in the north of Norway or a salmon in the Faroes. So I think that it does for me come down to seeing what the big picture is internationally, but not trying to bring a simple international solution. We have to have solutions that are right for Scotland, and I think we do a lot of good work there.
We had a question before the webinar from Steve Bracken, who I would imagine you'll all know as a veteran of the industry. Steve points out back in the 80s and 90s, there were big challenges, particularly from trunculosis and sea lice. And one of the approaches to deal with that was to introduce what they called low stress fish farming. Steve was asking, do you feel that fish farming as it currently is in the 2020s is low stress? And if not, there
suspect it's more stress than running a webinar would appear to be.
Well, we didn't get the second half of the question, actually. Thank you. You can repeat that one.
Yes. Yes, sorry. I'm going to see if I can. Well, we've got a. Right. Right. And now hopefully I'm a bit more plugged into the internet rather than relying on Wi-Fi. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay?
It seems to be at the moment, Rob.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. So anyway, so to recap, so Steve's question was relating to the approach taken in the 80s and 90s with challenges like furunculosis to introduce a more low stress means of farming salmon to reduce the impact of stress on the fish. And the question is farming in the 2020s, could that be described as low stress? And if not, are there ways to make it less stressful for the fish? And perhaps if we could begin with Ronnie and then Iain.
Yes, I think, and again, hello to Steve. I think it's certainly as stressful for farmers as it was back in those days. Is it more or less stressful for the fish? That's a really good question. The ideal thing you would do with a farm salmon is put it into its pen as a smolt, feed it, and take it out as a full-size salmon and do nothing else in between. That's not what happens because we have to intervene for a number of reasons. And I think I touched on earlier the fact that we, as part of a move away from medicines use, partly as a strategy, as part of a sustainable agenda in the use of medicines, partly because we have such a limited armory of medicines, we intervene more physically with fish these days, with thermolysers, with hydrolysers, and variations on those themes, with freshwater treatments in wellboats. Those are all really effective treatments, and they largely remove the stress of sea lice that was such a big issue back in those days that Steve and I both remember. But they come with stresses of their own, the physical handling of the fish. Even to do the freshwater treatments, you have to move them into a wellboat. So those interventions themselves are something that we have to really balance the pros and cons of. I believe they're a necessity just now. What I don't particularly like is that sometimes we have to use them because sea lice levels have reached a number that has been specified, not for the benefit of the fish who have the sea lice on them, but for a perceived benefit or lack of risk elsewhere. And I find myself sometimes having to do things which I consider might be stressful to fish, which go against my principle of first do no harm, which should always be our guiding principle. So I think we need to look at that, our interventions, and when we are compelled to use them to make the life of the fish less stressful. I think in terms of how we farm, there are, and in all that time that Steve's been involved and that I've been involved in farming, we have been evolving. There have been some steps forward, but generally there's been a big change. I mean, when I first started, we still had some fish in square wooden pens, and mostly we were in larger square steel pens. And now we're into larger and bigger circles and plastic, and getting larger. And there are real benefits, I think, to that move towards fewer and larger farms and fewer and larger pens within that for all sorts of reasons. And I think there is the ability for us to take stress out of the fish's life through that sort of movement. That's perhaps enough from me on that for a moment, at least.
Iain, any thoughts on stress and low stress farming?
Yeah, I'd maybe take a little bit of a step back a little bit and sort of hopefully add to what Ronnie said. You know, I would agree completely. In an ideal world, fish go into a pen and they're left there, and then they come out of the pen at the end of the cycle, and that's the perfect world. But of course, that's not how it often happens. And what we've seen, or what I've observed, two different layers here. What I've observed over sort of my time within Salmon Scotland is certainly a change in terms of the availability of tools that fish health professionals have access to, particularly around sea lice control, around gill health control. And I think that's really key. Interventions and activities sometimes come with decisions that need to be made about the best interest of the fish, but the benefit or when fish health is optimized and when fish stress can be minimized is when vets and health professionals have at their disposal a range of tools so that they can decide which one of those they can use in any one scenario and when they can use that. And we've seen that with lice control when we've increased from primarily medicines and sort of the area-based controls that Steve has referenced to being able to lay cleaner fish, functional feed, genetics, some of the other freshwater tools and this. As we build up that armory, it really does help and it gives professionals the choice. But the other thing I would say is that there is also a need for sort of regulatory support so that we can have diversity in how we farm our fish and where we farm our fish, and referencing Ronnie's point about sort of larger pens or perhaps larger farms or farms in different locations or more farms, so that companies can utilize their sort of production planning, utilize their years of experience to understand where and when fish should be in different places, and we need a kind of vibrant and forward-thinking regulatory system to allow us to have access to some of these tools, and that is a bit of a challenge, and it's something that, to be honest, within Salmon Scotland we do spend a lot of time sort of supporting our members and trying to lobby for sort of more pragmatism across that landscape.
Oh, so Charles, that's kind of over to the Scottish government, isn't it? And flexibility, pragmatism, do we need to see more of that?
I will address Iain's question first, and that is one of the major drivers behind the Farm Fish Health Framework is to bring questions to the table and look at them from a regulatory point of view, from a fish health point of view, from an environmental point of view. It's quite a large church. It's a broad church where these things can be considered. And it's certainly not a dead space. We have a almost constant dialogue either between individual companies or the sector representative bodies, and we are always engaged in trying to make the lot of the fish better. Coming back to Steve's original question, and I would reflect the fact that he went round the block a couple of times more than Ronnie and I even. Did we farm our fish better in the early days? I think the observation I would make is that we farm our fish differently, and we have an awful lot more knowledge, particularly with regard to risk assessment. Those tools and thinking have moved significantly forward since the early days of the industry. We have a lot more knowledge of what is there and potential means to address those difficulties. And with regard to welfare, there's been some really significant work done on fish welfare. It's really difficult to get a direct measure of fish welfare because to directly measure it in the fish, you have to take it out of its natural environment, which stresses it. So we have to use more indirect measures. And I would reflect on some work which was done by Institute of Aquaculture, looking at welfare indicators that we could apply indirectly. But possibly one of the biggest changes that I've seen since the early days is we farm our fish at a very different stocking density. Density generally is lower, and there is a cognizance within the industry as a whole with regard to where stocking density should be and is appropriate to different sizes of fish.
If I can stick with you, Charles, for a question about cleaner fish to begin with, because obviously cleaner fish have made a big difference in terms of managing lice numbers, but they're living creatures themselves. They have their own welfare issues. Are there any thoughts about in some way tracking data to show how well the industry is treating its cleaner fish as well as how it's treating its primary stock?
Firstly, I'll make a regulatory point that cleaner fish are aquatic animals. They are stocked into fish farms, and therefore, as an aquatic animal, they fall under they fall within the realm of the regulation. Generally, I would make the observation that cleaner fish are valuable. They are well looked after, but there are certain issues surrounding their use. And one of the problems that I see is there is a difficulty in accounting for them, particularly at the end of a cycle. They are stocked into pens. They do a very good job with regard to lice control. But at the end of the cycle, we don't necessarily understand the fate of all of the fish. So that is one thing that can be addressed. We understand an awful lot more about the range of pathogens which affect them. And indeed, we see treatments directed particularly to cleaner fish where infections are identified and they are treated accordingly. But one of the big issues in my mind is the fate of the individuals, and we are seeing an entire industry, whether that be farmed or wild capture, to support salmon farms going forwards in the provision of cleaner fish. But there are ongoing questions.
Does anybody else want to jump in on this one?
I can perhaps make some other observations as well. I mean, I would agree with what Charles is saying. I think this last point is important here, is that as with salmon farming, there's always improvements that can be made. Cleaner fish culture and use is, notwithstanding earlier use in the 90s, it is still relatively new. We have a new aquaculture species. The speed of learning has been very, very rapid. The speed of sort of development of protocols and the investment, I don't just mean in financial resources, but in terms of time, effort, the commitments of companies to have a welfare specialist on any farm that, a RAS specialist or cleaner fish specialist on any farm that has cleaner fish on them, who is there dedicated to look after that. There's been huge strides forward, and cleaner fish are an important part of our sector and our health management system, and we have to look after them as well. Just touching, sort of broadening this out slightly around the subject of sustainability of wild caught wrasse in particular, we are very aware of the concerns that present themselves, and we have been funding a PhD student who is actually entering his third year actually of looking at the sustainability of the fishery. We're confident, based on some preliminary data, that we are sustainable. We have to evidence that. We have to evidence everything with data. and we will hopefully be able to come forward and ensure that any fish that are still caught are done so sustainably. So I would say, yeah, there is cleaner fish. We have moved significantly. Always more to do, but there's always more to do with developing and learning with any time of farming and with salmon farming in particular.
Very quick question on we've got a question on bubble curtains being employed in other salmon farming regions to protect fish against things like harmful algal blooms and jellyfish. Just very quickly, just go around the panel, perhaps starting with Ronnie. Any interest in that being used more in Scotland?
I can give you a quick question, a quick answer. Yep, doing that.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, to be less flippant, absolutely. It's one of those pieces of international knowledge that we certainly have shared in this case, specifically with farmers on the west coast of Canada, who have, I think, probably been one of the prime pioneers in the use of bubble curtains and the plankton challenges. The whole use of gases generally, of oxygenation and of aeration, of using bubble curtains in upwelling, in response to specific issues of gill health, is something that's getting a lot of attention and is certainly an important part of our both prevention and treatment strategies going forward.
And we've also got a question on, you mentioned the difficulty of assessing fish health because the very act of examining the fish, I think Charles mentioned that, is problematic for the stress of the fish. We're looking at increasing use of technology and artificial intelligence and underwater cameras. Charles, do you see that as making a difference when that's being used more?
Yeah, initially, if I could correct you, the observation that I made was more with regard to assessing fish welfare rather than fish health. Yeah. Do I see it as a game changer? It will feed more data to the system, and indeed, we've all made the point, data very, very valuable. The ability to, for example, count lice without any intervention would be advantageous, not only from the fish's point of view, but from the continuity of data, where in other circumstances you couldn't carry out a physical count of lice. And thirdly, and I have to believe the technologists at the moment, I haven't seen the evidence directly myself, but the opportunity to identify individual fish within the system and actually see how their behavior is and whether any behavioral change, which is being seen automatically, whether we can take cues from that and improve the health and welfare of individual fish, or indeed populations of fish as a whole.
Iain, anything to add to that? Is there interest?
Yeah. I would like to add a few bits. Actually, I would agree that this is a hugely interesting area. Our members have already got camera technology. A lot of them are invested in new pieces of research and innovation around AI and the interpretation of that. And that's all helpful. And as Charles has said, that's all valuable data and feeds the decision making. The observation I would make is that I think this is hugely important, but that we need that information to then be appraised by an individual, and in this case, a vet. We can't take decision making into an automated, and I don't certainly know Charles isn't suggesting that, but and nobody is, but we need an individual at the end to collate all of that information, the relevant context, and make decisions based on the best availability of information. I would also make one other reflection, and that's one of stockmanship, which is a pretty difficult subject to kind of quantify, but it's the traditional sort of farmer looking at their animals that they're rearing and understanding from their behavior and how they are moving, whether there are challenges. And we see that really strongly in salmon farming. I don't think I've ever been onto a farm where I've not spoken to somebody and said, how are the fish? And they have an understanding of the behavior where they are in the water, and ensuring that feeds into this decision-making process is also really important. So technology and more information, excellent. Let's make sure we've still got somebody making the decision, or using all that information to make the decisions.
Ronnie, any thoughts on identifying individual fish? You could name them.
Yeah, yes, we would struggle for that number of names, but yeah, I think this feeds into, I think, a discussion that has been high on the agenda for the veterinary profession over the last couple of years, actually, which is about what having animals under our care means, and what the interaction has to be before, for example, medicines are prescribed. And it's very clear for us as fish vets that it can be quite different. It's certainly very different to someone working in a companion animal practice. I can learn more sitting at this computer, looking at the underwater cameras in the farms on the west coast or up in Shetland, than I can by standing on the surface looking down at the fish. And the guys on farm are spending all day, literally all day, looking at fish cameras. And that's a massive improvement in the knowledge that we used to have. And certainly the technology now for identifying fish, for looking at, for example, the level of winter ulcers, which has been a real challenge in Norway for some time, and which we see here. That sort of ability is massive. But as Iain said, it does actually all come down to people at the end of the day. What we take from the data and what we do with the data is vastly important. And I think that is the key point. We have some excellent people involved in fish farming here in Scotland, and that, of all things, is what gives me the most optimism for how we deal with the changing challenges that we face.
Well, thanks. We said we'd allow about an hour for the discussion. I think we're coming to the end of our allotted time. Had some great insights from the panel. Thank you to all of you, and some great questions. We didn't manage to cover all of the questions that we got from the audience out there. Hopefully they are include some topics that we can cover in future webinars and future articles in the Fish Farmer. Just remains to say that for those attending, or indeed for those who weren't able to attend, that a recording of this will be available fairly shortly via YouTube, and we'll be making that link available via our website and via our usual social media channels. And there'll be a report of this giving a summary of some of the topics that we were talking about in the next issue coming out in later in February of Fish Farmer magazine. So it just remains to say thank you to the panel, thank you to everybody who attended, and we look forward to seeing you at a future Aqua Agenda. Thanks very much.